small scale composting is our topic today. We are all muted by default, all of our attendees. We'll save most questions for the end, but if we have a lot of questions come up about one topic, or if there's a convenient pause to interject a question, we will be accepting questions throughout. So do please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll address them as time allows, but we will get to all of them. And this webinar is being recorded. It usually takes a couple weeks for Bosca to post them on the website, but it should be available by the end of this month. And for those of you who don't know, Bosca, or the Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency, represents 26 agencies from the San Francisco regional system. And behind the scenes, Bosca does a lot for municipalities. I work for the city, and Bosca really acts as a mediator between municipalities and other water agencies and the state. So I don't know if you've heard about the upcoming regulations that are going to be implemented over the next few years, but Bosca has done a magnificent job in speaking on behalf of all of the agencies that it represents to help communicate the needs of the cities and regional water districts that fall under its care. Those agencies provide water to 1.8 million people in our area, over 40,000 businesses and organizations from Santa Clara, San Mateo, and Alameda counties. And the primary goal is to make sure that the future water supply needs of the communities are met. And what we found over the years is that outdoor water use is the single largest untapped opportunity for water conservation. During the drought, when we really saw people turning off water for outdoor watering, that really, that saved us from having to go into more dire actions during that drought emergency, because conservation, the outdoor watering alone takes such a large amount of our water. So we're learning how to reduce that outdoor watering through programs like this, using water efficient plants and innovative garden techniques, including composting, which does increase soil's water holding capacity quite a lot, as I'm sure you'll learn later on. Some programs that are available to you all are Lawn Be Gone, similar to the program that Valley Water offers, which is the landscape conversion rebate. You can actually earn money per square foot for removing your thirsty lawn and transitioning it to drought tolerant plants. Also, the rain barrel rebate is $200 through Bosca's incentive program. A very straightforward and very effective rebate is the smart controller irrigation system. I believe Bosca only offers Reikio. If you're in Valley Water's territory, they offer a number of different controller options, and it's one of the easiest rebates to apply for, and it's one of the most lucrative for what you get. So if you're considering a new irrigation controller, look into that one. And Reed Garden rebates are $300 for the whole project that qualify. If you're a City of Santa Clara resident, it's a great time to remind you that if you are using drinking water to water your lawn, you can convert to less thirsty options with rebates from Valley Water and cost sharing with the City of Santa Clara. Residential rebates can earn up to $5,000, and for commercial properties up to $110,000. And it's very timely because next week, for those of you who don't know, is Drinking Water Week nationwide. So when you're thinking about all the efforts that go into collecting, transporting, and dispersing your drinking water, think about whether or not you really want to put all those resources straight out of your faucet and into your garden. You want to use as little of that as possible and keep that drinking water for more daily needs. As I mentioned, Valley Water offers lawn conversion rebates. The base rate is $1 per square foot to $2 per square foot, and different municipalities offer cost sharing to increase that. So check what your city might have to offer. And if you're looking into a garden renovation, South Bay Green Gardens has a lot of great landscape design plans, sample layouts, plant lists, resources on how to do different things, videos. So be sure to check them out. And here's a thank you from Valley Water for being interested in their conservation programs. This is one of our final topics for this series for spring, but there are a couple additional classes coming up after tonight. One is tomorrow night with pollinator plants and gardening with succulents on May 4th. And as a last resource for anybody who's considering a garden project, if you're not so familiar with plants, this last one is really great. It has a lot of photographs of completed gardens, and you can hover over different plants. It'll identify the plant for you, tell you its water needs and some other basic information. You can do all kinds of neat things with it. So if you're interested in just looking at plants, it's a great place to start. And with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to our instructor for tonight's presentation, Ms. Lori Caldwell.
Hello, everyone. Let me share screen. Excuse me. All right, yeah. Put my glasses on. From beginning. No. Sorry about that. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Today we are going to be talking about small scale composting. Like Victoria said, my name is Lori Caldwell. I'm a master composter, and I'm also known as the compost gal. I really feel that compost is the key to solving a lot of our, definitely a lot of our issues here in the state of California as far as gardeners are concerned. So today I'm going to talk about several different methods of small scale composting. So first of all, we're going to talk about why compost, the many benefits of using compost, and the benefits of composting in general. And then I'm going to start talking about basic composting. We're going to talk about worm composting. And then I also wanted to throw in a little bit about hugelkultur, because that actually is composting, but just a little bit different. We're going to be talking about compost critters, so what you can expect to see in your compost pile, and then some tips from a composter such as myself. And of course, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions. Please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'm happy to cover those for you. All right. So let me just get this in the way. So some of the many benefits of composting and using compost. It helps build healthy soil. Healthy soil is the key component to any successful, healthy garden. So compost is a great way to, if you have troubled soil, say you have clay soil, the use of compost over time is going to open up that clay soil to allow for water to percolate down, for roots, of course, to penetrate through all of other critters that live in the soil, allow them to move a lot more frequently and allow for more organic material to pass further down into the soil profile. I live in Martinez and we have sandy soil. So using compost in my soil is going to force those sandy particles that drain a lot of water and drain a lot of nutrition on very often. It's going to force those particles to clump together in order to hold onto water and nutrition a lot longer. So I'm not going to have to water as often, which is nice. And compost itself can hold its own weight in water. So that's a lot of water. It also helps with fluctuating temperatures and moisture levels in the soil. That lends itself to mostly plant health. A plant does not do very well if it has to go through constant wet and dry or hot and cold periods. It's going to be stressed out, and then it's going to become prey for any pest that's within the vicinity. So compost is going to keep everything nice and even. It's going to be a slow release nutrition to the plant instead of a quick release, like say like a Miracle Grow. So the plant is going to be able to take it up when it needs to take it up, and it's going to help definitely with things like growth and stuff. It helps balance the pH in your soil. And then it also unlocks nutrition, like things like nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil, and make that available to plants as well. It is an excellent way to divert waste from the landfill. A lot of the stuff that you may consider maybe putting in your organics cart or your green cart, and then have that taken away. That does become compost, and I definitely want to talk about that at the end of this, at the beginning, because there's a great opportunity for a lot of cities, a lot of home gardeners to get free compost nowadays. I definitely want to talk to you about that. So organic wastes, they stay out of the landfill. We do have a landfill ban, and a lot of counties have landfill bans. So all the organics are not being composted, of course. So it's going to keep all that stuff on site. So you're basically going to be closing the loop. I love the idea of I can go out to my backyard and I can grow all my plants, my fruit trees, my annuals, my native plants, and then I just take either wood wastes or any kind of leaves or anything from that. I enter that all back into my compost bin. It breaks down, and then I get a finished product, and then I take that and I just reintroduce that back into any new annuals I'm planting or back onto the perennials that I'm growing. And I just kind of close that loop, and then I don't have to go out and purchase compost. The best compost is the compost that you make yourself, because you know how long it's been decomposing, you know exactly what's been put in it and everything. And it's a lot easier to, I don't want to say control, because it's still a definitely natural process, but you can help facilitate that as the composter for sure. Adding compost to soils is going to help with things like erosion. I mean, the best example I could use for that is, generally speaking, we end up in California with fire season, and then all that organic material is gone, and then the first rains come, and then the soil gets carried away, especially stuff like clay soil for certain. So compost as organic material is going to keep the soil in place, as opposed to like with clay, water gets underneath it, lifts it up, and slides it through. This way, if it's clay, it's a little bit more porous. Water's going to percolate through it, as opposed to picking it up and taking it away. So that's also beneficial for a lot of reasons. You want that soil to stay in place, and you also don't want it to end up in any water systems. That causes a whole host of problems with oxygen and whatever, the wildlife and everything that's in, whether it be a lake or stream or ocean, stuff like that. You definitely want to try to avoid that. It helps reduce greenhouse gases. So again, organics in most places are not allowed in landfill. Some of them still use things, they call it alternate daily cover. So at the end of the day, they'll take organic material, usually yard waste, I believe, and they'll cap the landfill. And unfortunately, when that happens, all that material ends up breaking down without the benefit of oxygen. It breaks down anaerobically, and then of course is a lot of our greenhouse gases, things like methane, carbon dioxide, which are very problematic as far as global warming is concerned. It does save you money. Like I said, best compost you use the compost you can make at home. And then you're able to, instead of going out and purchasing stuff, you can go ahead and make it on yourself. And then you can take all that extra money and buy plants. That's usually what I do with my extra. So I want to talk to you first about hot and cold composting. Now, as a composter, depending on how much materials you have, and when we're talking about hot and cold composting, we're talking about primarily composting using things like yard waste and potential things like fresh prunings or like food scraps as well. This is my current system in the backyard. On the left, I have what's known as my hot pile. Each of these containers is about a cubic yard, approximately 3 by 3 by 3. You can do hot or cold composting in both of those. Like I said, the one on the left, that was technically my hot pile. I'm mixing food waste and yard waste in that pile. The pile on the right is a leaf mold pile. I am just popping dried leaves in there, and I'm watering them in. It takes a long time. It's a longer process, but fungus is leading the charge for that. And I'll talk about that as we get a little bit more into it. All right. So if you decide you want to do basic composting, again, you have to figure out a couple of things. Number one, what do I have to compost? Do I have a lot of yard waste? Do I have things like chipped wood or branches or dried leaves? Do I have any of those kind of materials? Do I have things like food scraps or fresh prunings that I could utilize? If the answer is then yes, then you go ahead and set it up. If you find that you don't have a lot of yard waste, but you have more food scraps than anything else, then I would take into consideration doing something like worm composting, which I'll be talking about later. So you're going to get yourself a bin. If you are thinking about incorporating things like food scraps, you're going to want to make that bin rodent resistant. So regardless if it's, sometimes bins come with the base that you sit on, because basically the idea is you don't want anything to dig underneath and then come up into your pile. So creating a barrier on the bottom, whether it's sitting on top of some sort of barrier, or you make your own. I always recommend something like 1/4-inch hardware wire, and then you're just going to put it in to the bottom as well as a little bit on the sides. So if anything's going to try to crawl up in there, it's not going to be able to, and won't be able to do that for certain. So you'll find yourself a nice little compost pile or compost bin. If you're thinking about doing something like just leaves, those are called no-fuss piles. So you don't have to worry about making that rodent resistant. Mine, my leaf mold pile doesn't have anything on it. It's just leaves and leaves and leaves. That's it. So, but if you are incorporating food scraps, it is important to try to make that rodent resistant as much as possible. Place it in the shade if you can. Shade is as key as far as keeping the moisture of your pile on an even level. Most compost bins are black in color. If put in the sun, they're going to generate heat, and it potentially could dry out your bin. One of the basic misnomers in composting is the idea that you should put your compost pile in the sun because that's where the heat is generated. But that's not true. The heat that's generated within a compost pile occurs in the dead center of the pile, and it's run by bacteria, thermophilic bacteria. And as they start to multiply and grow in population, as they rub together, that's what generates the heat. So by putting your bin in the shade, you're actually keeping the moisture and everything on an even keel, and which keeps decomposition going. Putting it in the sun actually slows down decomposition. My option in my place was only to put it in the sun. It's actually kind of partially shaded now, but I always find that I always have to water it a lot more often, and I always have to pay attention to it a little bit more often if I want to keep decomposition going. So shade is always going to be a welcome place for your compost pile for sure. All right. So in your basic bin, you're looking at your basic compost recipe, and I will go ahead and define those in the next slide. You're looking for browns, greens, air, water, thyme, and then you get compost. It really all depends on the composter, how quickly this process goes. So if you're out and you're maintaining it and you're adding to it on a pretty consistent basis, it's going to go a little bit faster. But if you are either dividing your materials between other composting systems, or you're just a busy person, everything will break down. It'll just break down at a much slower rate. So we always just say compost happens because it would eventually break down. When you're building a pile, you're doing that first initial building of it. When I'm setting it up, I want to do what's known as 50-50 by visual inspection. So I usually start off with browns. Those are something that's very high in carbon, usually kind of dry and brittle. So dried leaves or wood, like things like logs or branches, things like straw are always good. All those things are considered browns, very high in carbon. Greens are usually things that are fresh or wet, and they contain a fair amount of nitrogen. We're looking to combine that carbon and nitrogen together. So food scraps, like fruit and vegetable peelings, like coffee, tea, herbivore manures, stuff like that. You're going to be mixing them together. So if I'm putting down 4 inches of browns, I'm going to put 4 inches of greens on top, and I'm going to continue with that until I fill my bin or until I run out of materials for sure. When it comes to water, I want to be able to go into my compost pile, grab some material, and just squeeze it and see how much liquid comes out. A couple of drops, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for damp as a wrung out sponge. If water just runs down my arm, then it's definitely too wet. And I don't want decomposition to slow down because of that. So I'm going to have to regulate that. And I usually do that with something that's dry, And brittle usually incorporates some sort of browns with that. Aeration. If you are in the position or you have the time to completely turn your compost pile by taking all your materials from the bottom and mixing them with the top, or moving your bin to another area and then moving that over, you're more than welcome to do that. It might slow down the process a little bit in some places, depending on when you're actually doing it. But I'm here to tell you that you really don't have to do that. We're all really about incorporating some air into it, not necessarily mixing old with new, because what happens is I'm going to build a pile, and then as things start to break down, all my finished compost is going to sift through all the undecomposed stuff and settle on the bottom of my compost pile, or my compost bin, excuse me. So if I'm just aerating it, I'm digging at it with a digging fork or a pitchfork or a shovel. I'm trying to lift it up, because it does have a tendency, as I'm adding to it, everything gets wet, everything gets kind of heavy, and then the pore spaces close off, and then that slows down decomposition. So if I could just get in there and incorporate a little bit of extra air, and that rush of air will help keep decomposition going for sure. So you don't necessarily have to turn. I just recommend aerate. And sometimes I liken it to like tossing a salad in my compost pile. I just want to lift it up and let it go and incorporate a lot more oxygen into it. There's some basics for what's browns and greens. Like I said, carbon and dry those browns. So things like dried leaves, which are my personal favorite. There's things like straw, wood ashes in very small amounts. They have a tendency to kind of mess with the pH sometimes of your compost pile. And of course, any wood ashes would be of something if you're just actually just burning wood. So no duraflames or any kind of toxic chemicals or stuff like that. Wood, branches, sawdust, chipped up wood, those make for pretty decent browns, especially if you're incorporating a lot of wet material. And in a pinch, things like newspaper and cardboard can kind of go to bat for you, but they're kind of like the Pringles of browns, where they don't have as much of the integrity as some of the other browns that I have listed. So if you have to incorporate things like shredded newspaper or shredded cardboard in your compost pile, I would consider just making sure that you're going to want to maintain it, because it's going to mat and it's going to compact, and then it might slow down decomposition. So making sure you get in there and incorporate a lot more air into it would be helpful. The biggest suggestion I can have for you as far as browns are concerned, especially since you know you're going to be composting, is to collect them in the fall. I go around in the fall, hopefully before it rains, and I collect as many leaves as I can from my neighborhood, or I get them from friends. That way, in the summertime, when my bin is going to be wet and full of a lot of, rinds and stuff from summer, very high water content summer produce, or I'm doing projects with citrus, or I'm making beer or something like that, I need those browns to kind of offset the moisture, and dried leaves do a great job of that. So always try to bank those browns whenever possible. Pine needles, you can use those also as browns. However, because a lot of evergreens, they have that kind of waxy cuticle on the outside. If you do incorporate pine needles, always make sure you either cut them or break them. That way bacteria and fungus can go in those exposed areas and actually help break them down. Otherwise, it'll take a much longer time for them to break down. All right. And then there's greens. Again, they're very fresh, high in nitrogen. Grass clippings from untreated lawns. I specify that because a lot of lawn chemical contains a lot of chemicals, things that you definitely don't want to incorporate into your compost pile. Not only do they not compost out, but they may have the tendency to bioaccumulate, to build up. And again, everything you put in your compost pile is eventually going to end up somewhere on your garden. So if it's just a regular old lawn and you haven't put any weed or feed or any chemicals on it, then they do make excellent feedstocks for your compost pile. They contain a lot of nitrogen, almost to the fact that once they lose their green color and they're still brown, they still contain a significant amount of nitrogen in them. And if you use them in your bin, you can get really high temperatures because of that. That and things like chicken manure, fresh chicken manure, that is, have a tendency to help increase the temperature in your pile. Things like tea leaves and coffee grounds. You can throw the whole tea bag in there if the tea bag is actually made of paper. Coffee grounds, including the paper filter, can all go in there. Eggshells. When I say food scraps, it's mostly just fruits and vegetables. You can put citrus rinds, eggshells, any kind of thing that's raw, or you find a moldy apple somewhere, that can all be incorporated into that. Weeds without seeds, for sure. The seeds will not most likely get hot enough. Your bin won't get hot enough to kill them off. So I would say weeds if you're kind of desperate for greens in a pinch, for sure. Any kind of urban manure, cow, horse, guinea pig, rabbit, chicken. I spoke about chicken, how hot it can get your pile. There's a couple of things about herbivore manure, specifically usually around horses and cows. Sometimes you have to take into consideration if it's your horse or cow, then you know exactly what it's been fed, you know exactly where it's been grazing. I always have big concern with a thing called persistent herbicides. Again, kind of like the things with grass clippings, they don't cook out. So you have to take into consideration, what did the animal eat? Were there persistent herbicides in that? And then if they are just left to graze, has that field also been sprayed with persistent herbicides? You definitely don't want to incorporate that into your compost pile. It holds on to those herbicides so badly that in some instances, those people who have completely tainted manures actually use that manure to kill weeds in their fields, because it still contains a significant amount of herbicides in it. So you definitely want to try to avoid that. So always find out, and feel free to ask if the origin of the feed, as well as the grazing habits of those animals. And then things like hair, fur, and feathers. I incorporate my hair into my compost pile whenever I brush it out. You're brushing your dog, you're brushing your cat, just as long as they don't have any other chemicals on them as well. You could definitely take that into consideration. All right, I see a couple of questions before I get into pile building. Let's see what we have.
One about weeds you already answered. We did have a question regarding cardboard. What about like a cereal box that has print or labels on it? Is that compostable?
It is, but I would check to see. I'm always concerned about colored inks, especially very bright colored inks. Not like newspaper, not like newsprint. That's all soy-based inks now. But I would definitely double check and see if it would. But if it is, then absolutely. And yes, you can definitely get your soil tested if you have that as a consideration, and then ask specifically to see if they would test for herbicides. Can shredded printer paper be used instead of newspapers? Yes. Again, as long as the ink is soy based, and generally, like if I'm shredding up say like a bank statement or something, it should say on the bottom, this is made with recycled content paper with soy-based inks. So certainly you can't always just check for that. Compostable plastic bags, no. Compostable plastic bags, unfortunately, are not compostable. We're actually working on some legislation right now to actually have those removed from the whole waste stream, because they become actually quite problematic in municipal compost system, where they kind of mess with the machinery. They get caught up in the gears and they have to stop, and it never breaks down. And all it does break down, it just breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces of compostable plastic. So definitely I would not incorporate that as part of my my compost pile, for certain. All right. And you're welcome to whoever said thank you. All right. So I'm gonna move on to pile building by the steps. So I've set up my bin. It's in a shady spot. I'm going to be incorporating food scraps. So I've made it rodent resistant. I've got a lid for it. I'm good to go. So now I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm going to start with a brown, either something, I always like to start with something kind of coarse whenever possible. Again, I'm always trying to incorporate extra oxygen into my compost pile. So if you've got logs or branches, those make excellent kind of base for your pile. They will be incorporated into your compost pile over several times because it will take a long time for it to break down. But the benefit of it is it creates the space, especially at the bottom, where there's a gap where there's going to be oxygen in there. And that's always going to be something key. And then they're just really out of the way. You don't have to mess with them. Eventually, they will definitely break down. So I'm going to start with some branches. I'm going to fill kind of the gaps with some browns, and depending on how deep that is. So let's say that's 4 inches. Then I'm going to take 4 inches of my greens. I'm going to layer that on top. I'm going to water it in, and I'm going to aerate through each layer. Just kind of toss the salad, and I'm going to keep doing it until I run out of greens or run out of browns. And if you have a lot, you can be successful. But if you only have a little bit of material, maybe your pile building is 1 inch of browns and 1 inch of greens. I still say do it. I say your pile is 10 inches of browns or 10 inches of greens. Definitely go ahead and do it. So you're going to layer with equal amounts, water and aerate it in. So, and then you're going to top it off with a brown. So every time I open up a compost bin or compost pile, I should always see browns on the top. It's going to help control the moisture, keep the moisture in. It's also going to help with things like fruit flies and stuff like that. So you always want to see a brown when you open up your bin. Cutting up materials smaller to increase their surface area, so things like bacteria and fungus on it. Those are always kind of key components when it comes to making a compost pile. Admittedly, sometimes I don't have time for that. And so sometimes I just go ahead and put the stuff in. I have no shame in doing that. Aerate as often as you possibly can. And then when the time comes to add some additional greens, I'm going to take my browns and I'm going to pull them back till I get to the center of the pile. That's where I'm going to put my new greens. And then I'm going to put the browns back on top of that. So don't dump and run. That's what we call it. Don't just throw it on top and put the lay on top, because the next time you come out, chances are you're going to be inundated with fruit flies. And that's no fun. So real quick, I want to talk about the layering of greens and browns, and I have a couple of asterisks on it. So I have a good friend. He brews beer. He makes cider. And so the feedstocks from that are very high in nitrogen, of course, spent grains, pressed fruit, but it contains a lot of water. I mean, a significant amount of water. So I always have to take in consideration what my greens are in order to make sure that I have a good balance of the brown. So if the greens that you're having, you just did a big juicing thing, and now you have a lot of citrus rinds, or again, like, you make apple cider, or you're making beer, or you're making something where the feedstock has a lot of water in it. Always make sure that you do a decent job of making sure you compensate and add some more browns to that, to really make sure that that really balances out nice, so decomposition can move forward for sure. Again, those greens are in the pile. And then I'm going to go ahead and cover those with the brown so that you don't have to worry about being seen. One of the questions I always get about composting is, what about citrus? Yes, you can incorporate citrus into your basic bin. I wouldn't put it in a worm bin, but you can put it in a basic bin. Again, your compost pile should be sitting on soil. So that way, at the passage of all your compost critters, they can come and go. If the situation in your bin is too much citrus, then your compost critters are going to go to the extreme, or they're going to leave the bin temporarily until the situation rectifies itself, but then they'll be back to kind of finish the job. Definitely. All right. Hot piles, anything that's about the size of my bin or larger. Again, thermophilic bacteria, they are the ones that are really running the show. And so if I'm building my pile correctly, and if I've made it 3 by 3, and I've done my balance of reds and greens really well, what's going to happen is I'm going to see within the first 2 or 3 days of building the pile, I'm going to see a significant change in the temperature. I don't have a compost thermometer. I'm not really a big gadget girl. But if I open the lid on my bin and there's a lot of condensation, or I can actually feel heat being generated in the pile, and I could also see significant shrinkage. You can expect your pile to shrink by easily by a third if you create a decent hot pile. When your pile is going through a hot phase, you don't want to mess with it. You don't want to aerate it. You don't want to water it. You just want to step back, because and then sometimes it's more than 3 days, but always kind of keep a check on it. But once it kind of gets down to a decent amount of, somewhere like 120 or something like that, then you can work with your pile for certainly. So hot piles, you get faster decomposition. Chances are, depending on how hot you get it, you can kill off weed seeds, which is nice, and generally some pathogens. But say you don't have a lot of material to make a 3x3 pile, you can still be successful. Coal piles have a really great history of what they do, because again, you're going to be getting a lot of worms. There's still bacterial involvement, but it's only just a very shallow. I call them the kind of the nanny bacteria, because eventually your hot pile is going to become a cold pile, because it's eventually going to cool down, and then mesophilic bacteria are going to come into play. And eventually, as you continue to add to your cold pile, you might actually get a hot pile. It might actually get a temperature and start to shrink. So basically, hot piles or cold piles are only called as such as when you go to actually build them for the first time. Every pile gets hot, every pile gets cold as well. All right. And then the last thing I want to talk about basic composting is what's known as the leaf mold pile. So say you have so many leaves that you have enough leaves to support your basic composting of your nitrogen and your carbon together, but you have an excess of leaves. I found I did as well. So basically, I just put them in a container and watered them, and now I'm waiting for them to break down. And it takes a long time. It could take anywhere from 6 months to sometimes 2 years, because sometimes you just keep adding more and more leaves on them. Instead of bacteria kind of running the show in a leaf mold pile, it's really about fungus, and that's what kind of slows it down. So my hot pile compost is going to be what's known as bacteria dominant, and my leaf mold pile is going to be kind of fungal dominant. While the fungal dominant doesn't provide as much nutrition, say, as the bacterial stuff would, it's still going to have all those other great qualities of compost. It's still going to be able to aerate those soils, clump those soils. It's still going to lend itself to moisture, holding on to moisture and everything like that. And it's kind of fun, admittedly. So we talked about everything that goes in. So let's quickly talk about stuff that stays out. So any kind of treated wood, of course, things like charcoal, definitely. Any feces from dogs, cats, or tropical birds. That's things like E. coli, toxoplasmosis, stuff like that. That never would be able to kind of be destroyed in a home bin for certain. Unfortunately, that stuff would actually have to go to the landfill. Things like meat, dairy, grains, and cooked food. You don't want to attract anything to the bin. And then, of course, it's not going to break down with the advent of things like worms and roly-polies. It is going to be breaking down with the advent of things like fly maggots, which that I don't want to discourage anybody to compost, but you definitely want to try to avoid that. Things like oil and grease. All of our compost critters that live in our bin or live in our soil, they breathe through their skin. So oil and grease is going to suffocate them. So just be mindful. If you think you're going to, I'm putting salad in here, it's all vegetables, but it's all been dressed with an oil-based salad dressing. You definitely want to try to avoid that. Any kind of noxious weeds. This is just a very short list because there's a very long list of noxious weeds. Think of ivy, all that stuff. You don't want to incorporate that. A lot of them grow by broken pieces. A lot of them would end up being actually happy in your compost pile, and will eventually take over your compost pile. And then when you spread your compost, then all those get spread as well. Any toxic substance, I talked about glossy paper. And then again, things like diseased plants as well. Again, unless you know, and when you become a more comfortable composter, you'll know about the really good high temperatures. If you incorporate things like thermometers, you can kind of keep track of that. You want to always make sure that the hotter it gets, it's going to kill off a lot more bad stuff, not necessarily good stuff. All right. So troubleshooting. Now, first of all, I have smelly. Your compost pile should not smell. If it does, chances are A, you haven't buried your stuff underneath the browns, or B, you're putting the wrong kind of greens in the pile. You're incorporating things like the meats or the foods and stuff like that. So easily corrected, you're going to pull out those bad things. Sometimes if it's too wet, I'm going to want to incorporate some browns into it. I'm going to want to aerate it, add some browns, and then make sure I top with a brown as well. Fruit flies, again, too wet or unburied greens. So burying those under the pile. Also, if it's really bad, then I'm going to fill the remainder of my bin all the way to the top with dried leaves or any kind of, any kind of high carbon, any kind of brown. Fruit flies mate in midair. So if I take away that air, then that's that last generation that's going to exist. So say I build a pile. I think I'm building a hot pile. I think I've got the ratio good. I come back 3 days later expecting it to be shrunken by a third, but it looks exactly the same as it did when I built it. So chances are decomposition is stalled. So usually it's a balance problem or it's a moisture problem. So generally speaking, that means I probably have not enough greens or too many browns, or I have to incorporate water. So chances are I'm probably going to try to incorporate some more greens, I'm going to aerate it, and then I'm going to definitely water it and make sure I top it with a brown just to make sure, and then come back in a couple of days. I always find it a lot easier to fix a pile that's too wet. I can bring it back to a better place than dealing with a pile that's too dry and forcing it a little bit. I hope that makes sense. So sometimes if a bin is really too wet, all I have to really do is add some browns to it, and it's gonna rectify itself. If it's too dry, then I either have to go full bore and make it wet, or I have to do kind of like a stair step where I need to keep trying and keep trying and keep trying and keep trying and see and play with it a little bit too much. I don't have time for that. So for me, I might just let it be really wet and then just pull it back using browns. Bugs are an important part of the composting process. Sometimes there's things in there that you don't want to see. Sometimes I saw a lizard in my pile one day. I got no problem with that. Ants like to hang out there. Sometimes you see snails and slugs or spiders. The compost critters are all supposed to be there. One of my first jobs in kind of the composting field was I was answering questions on a composting hotline, and a woman called one day and asked me, she saw bugs in her pile, and she basically took a can of Raid and sprayed the entire contents of her pile with Raid and asked me what her next option was. And unfortunately, I told her that she had to throw everything into the landfill because she basically just killed everything good, more good than bad. Unwanted guests, I'm mostly speaking of the naked-tailed or banded variety of unwanted guests. So making sure that you're not putting anything in there that shouldn't be in there. Excuse me, if you have concerns with them attempting to get in there, locking down the lid with a bungee cord. Raccoons are pretty smart, so you kind of have to do a little bit more heavy lifting. Cinder blocks, anything that's going to keep anything from getting into your pile, for sure. All right. So how do I know it's ready? When it doesn't look like anything that I originally had put it in. And again, that's why I don't like to turn. I like to aerate, because when I dismantle my bin, all I have to do is take all the undecomposed stuff off the top and set that aside. I'll reintroduce that back into my compost pile later. And then the bottom third or sometimes 2/3 of my bin is just all finished compost. And then I just have to sift it out a little bit just to sift out, sometimes the chunky stuff, pits or, avocado skins. They look like leather in there. All different types of stuff sometimes rocks, all kinds of stuff. So I like to sift it, and then usually I'll just kind of set it to the side. I can use it right away, but if I don't want to, I can just put it on bare earth, water it, and throw a tarp over it for a few weeks. It's called curing it. It's completely outside of the whole composting system, but it's just kind of like its honeymoon. It's this last chance for any kind of organic material to be finished, broken down without having to be as part of the main system for certain. So I always want to store it covered and keep it moist. Keeping it moist is always want to keep it viable. That's very important as well, because there's a lot of microorganisms in it that rely on that moisture and that water in order to stay viable and alive. So how I'm going to use it is, so say I'm getting ready to put my tomatoes in my containers or my raised beds. I'm just going to, what's known as top dressing. I'm just going to take about 1 to 2 inches of that compost, and I'm just going to put it right on top of the soil, and I'm just going to rake it in with my fingers. Again, when I water it, it is going to percolate down into the soil, and worms will be able to grab it and bring it down. If I'm mixing it with soil, I'm going to use 1 part compost, about 3 to 5 parts soil for certain. And then that's great for planting things like trees and shrubs. It's called backfilling. I grow everything in containers here in Martinez. And so inside containers, the nutrition is relatively limited. So things go relatively fast. Most edible crops are known as heavy feeders, so it's going to be taking up a lot of nutrition. So I have to amend and fertilize pretty regularly. For me, especially my fruit trees, and especially as the temperature starts to kind of climb, I'm always going to make sure that I'm going to side dress, which means I'm going to do 1 to 2 inches around the base of my fruit trees or any of my perennial shrubs prior to the heat. And then I'm going to top that with some coarse mulch on top of it. I want my plants to be ready for the hot weather, for the temperatures for certain, as well as just, irrigating them a little bit more as well. And then you also have the option of making a compost tea, which is a much longer process involving aeration and a sugar source and 24-hour stirring and that type of thing. But there's a lot of great benefits to that, because you can actually use it topically on your trees. So the nutrition is going to be able to pass through all the holes, the stoma they're called, in the leaves. So you're going to be able to provide nutrition to them directly, as well as, and when you aerate it, all the microorganisms, again, I'm going to be feeding them. I'm going to be giving them oxygen. Their populations are going to increase. So when I spray it on my trees and my plants, the microorganisms are going to go to town on any potential pests or diseases that your plants have as well. So there's a really great benefit to that. My sifter, some things that get sifted out. A lot of pits, big seeds. All right, before I start moving on to worm composting, let's see what some of the questions were. Okay. I have a bin with a crank. Oh, a tumbler. We know those, call those tumblers. Yeah, it does make it difficult. Is it not that, is that not possible to, you can, the thing about compost tumblers is, and it varies between the tumbler, it's really about the batch method. The idea is you're just supposed to fill it, and then you spend the rest, then the compost spends the rest of its life just being maintained by being watered and by being aerated by cranking it. The issues that I always have with the compost tumblers is the fact that they do not make any contact with the ground whatsoever. You're really losing a lot of stuff with that, because it's really important for your compost critters to be able to come and go as they please. It's very important, especially things like roly-polies or columbola. They are your first line in there. They're there to shred down a lot of our fiber, things that are made of lignin or cellulose. They're there to shred it down so bacteria and fungus can get on it and help really break that down. So they also do have a tendency to dry out relatively, so sometimes you have to water them pretty often. My mom had a tumbler, 2-door tumbler, one top and one bottom. the bottom door fell off. And so I took it off its frame and then I buried it 6 inches into my mom's backyard, and the lid's on top. It's a very small compost bin, but it works a lot better than it does now that it's in contact with the ground, because like I said, and it holds on to moisture a lot longer as well too. I hope that answers your question. So the leaves on my orange tree. If they're brown, then they're considered a brown. If they're fresh, I would consider them a green. So yes, those orange tree leaves are definitely good, but I would mostly consider them as a green for certainly. Does increase the number of whirling beetles and mites in your compost pile? The only problem I would have possibly with the mites would be, it really all depends. I just learned the other day that there's all different types of mites. Sometimes there's the mites that unfortunately might attack some of your other compost critters or try to dominate your other compost critters, specific things like worms. But there are also predatory mites as well. So you might be having a battle of predatory mites against regular mites, which is good. But in a big kind of system like that, I wouldn't worry too much about that. And they are helping to decompose. I don't know about the whirling beetles. Those might be predaceous ground beetles. And if that's the case, then those guys are good. They're not decomposers, but they do prey upon snails and slugs and their eggs, which is something you definitely want as well. Because sometimes you do see snails and slugs in a compost pile, especially if it's you haven't been maintaining it for a while. Let's see. Do you recommend a compost starter? I do not recommend a compost starter. The compost starter are your browns and your greens. Usually a compost starter is either urea or something else that's high in nitrogen in order to get the temperature relatively hot. But if you're doing the pile building correctly, then you've got that already. So I wouldn't even try to incorporate that. Banana peels would definitely be considered a green because, again, they're fresh and wet. So don't let the color fool you. So because coffee grounds are brown, but they're high in nitrogen and they're fresh and wet. So technically they are considered a green. Banana peels, your apples, your lettuce, your leaves, your tree collards, all of those would be considered to be greens. And so, yeah, you'll definitely treat that. Are you supposed to be okay with snails? I'm okay with snails in my compost pile, but I'm not okay with snails in my garden. So definitely go battle with them in your garden, but I wouldn't be too concerned about them in my compost pile for sure. Do eggshells need to be thoroughly cleaned? They do not. You just go ahead and crumble them up, and you can go ahead and incorporate those in your compost pile. You do have also the option of taking them, incorporating them in your garden as well. So I'm just going to let that piggyback on Sarah's comment. So take those eggshells, grind them at very fine, like down to a powder almost. And then I'm going to create kind of a barrier around my existing plants using those crushed eggshells. They don't like to crawl over that. For them, it's like crawling over broken glass. So you can go ahead and incorporate that. Or again, put the eggshells in your compost pile. I don't like to crush them up because the little kind of cups, compost critters like to hang out in there. So I always like to provide them with a little bit of help. The black beetles, if they're black and they have kind of like a shiny opalescent kind of on their back, then yeah, those are the predaceous ground beetles. They're probably maybe less than an inch long. Those are the guys who are eating the snails and slugs in their eggs. So definitely, if you don't have them and you want to bring them to your yard, start incorporating things like mulch around the base of your plants and your trees and around your planter boxes and stuff like that. And they'll come. That's their habitat. And then they will, especially on the edge of planter boxes, because in the morning the snails are going to be coming out to hide, and then the beetles will be waiting for them. So yes. All right. Great questions, everyone. All right. So now let's talk about a worm bin. These are two of my old worm bins. This picture's kind of old, but the thing is, these are in my living room. Actually, I have a worm bin just right over my shoulder, over here in the corner, and I do have a worm bin outside as well. Oopsie. So worm bins are going to be great for folks who don't have a lot of yard waste and just really just have food waste. The food is all going to be the same thing as you would put in your basic bin with a few exceptions. I'm not going to incorporate my citrus for sure. I'm also not going to incorporate anything that's like too aromatic. So I'm going to avoid things with like oil. So no rosemary or oregano or any kind of, kind of herb like that. And then I'm going to want to avoid something kind of spicy. So no peppers, no garlic, no onions, because your worms, unlike in your basic bin, they don't have the option of escaping. They're in a container and they're locked into that container. So I would definitely not incorporate any of that stuff. So this is basically food scraps, and you're providing bedding for them, whether it be dried paper, newspaper, which is my favorite for worm bins if you can find it. I'm doing a great job with cardboard egg cartons as well, and shredded cardboard. Excuse me. And if you need to go out and buy something, then you could try something like a coconut coir, which is the hairy stuff on the outside of the coconut. If you can't find any of the other stuff, because newspaper is definitely hard to find. So when I'm setting up a bin, I either going to go out and buy a bin, or I'm going to make a bin. And to have a bin is relatively easy. I just went to Target and I got a toter, and I'm just going to drill some holes along the top edge again, because all of our critters definitely need that oxygen in order to breathe, just like us. Excuse me. And so from there, I'm going to shred my bedding, and I'm going to wet it. So like I said, I'm going to use paper. I'm going to wring out the paper, kind of damp as a wrung out sponge, and I'm going to layer about 1 to 2 inches on the bottom of my bin. If you go out and buy a bin and say it's like a stackable bin with the intention of those are kind of migrating bins, usually kind of for the ease of harvest. So when you start off with a tray like that, there's a lot of holes on the bottom of that tray, and you definitely want your worms to stay in place. And in the early days, when you're incorporating all this paper and some food, it's very easy for the worms to slip down through it and down to the bottom, where they eventually die, unfortunately. So if you have a migrating bin that has slots on the bottom, my first thing I would tell you before you put the wet paper would just be to put a piece of cardboard, a solid piece of cardboard on the bottom. It's going to keep everything in the tray where you need it. And eventually the worms, of course, are going to eat that cardboard. So when the time comes to harvest, and I'll talk about that when we talk about harvesting, when the time comes to harvest, then that cardboard will already be gone. So wet paper, worms, and some food. The worms we're looking for are red wigglers. They're the type of worms that you might see when you're out on a hike and you're just hanging out by some trees, and you just kind of pull back the duff and like the top couple of inches of soil. Those are the types of worms you're going to see, and they exist in a very shallow portion of the soil and amongst the duff. So when it comes to a worm bin, it doesn't have to be very deep. No more than like a foot. It could be shallow, but more than a foot would be too much for them to definitely handle, as far as getting to the food and stuff like that. So it doesn't occupy a lot of space. I usually start off with about 1 pound of the red wigglers, and then usually about 1 quart of the food. And I talked about what goes in that. Those go in the middle. I do another couple inches of wet paper, and then I'm going to shred some dry paper on the top. Now, fortunately, a lot of the problems you might have in a worm bin are going to be easily solved with dry paper. And anytime my dry paper layer on the top gets too moist, I'm just going to shred it and incorporate some more dry paper. Again, all the worms and all your compost critters are eventually going to eat this paper and incorporate that into part of their diet as well. So you'll see that starting to disappear. This is my living room. And then I keep mine indoors, but I also have an outdoor bin. I have one of those migrating bins outdoors. So Depending on where you get your worms, sometimes they come by mail, sometimes you can go pick them up, sometimes, they have to take a car ride. So I'm going to set them up and give them about a quart of that food, and then I'm going to leave them alone for about a week. The nice thing about the worms is I can go on vacation for a couple of weeks. As long as I give them a decent amount of food, I should be good to go for those couple of weeks. If my vacation extends up beyond those 2 weeks, then my worms do need a babysitter. So you have to have a conversation with a friend or relative or neighbor about taking care of your worms over your vacation, which I always think is hilarious because people don't think people should have worms in their houses, but anyway. So it takes them about a week to kind of settle in. And then after that, you can feed them consistently. They can eat roughly anywhere half their body weight or up to their body weight in food. Now, this is just for the worms alone. If you find yourself in a bin that has a significant amount of compost critters aside from your worms, then you do have to take that into consideration because you're also feeding those ones as well. So I could feed it, and then in 24 hours, all that food should technically be gone. And then I can just feed them. Again, just like your basic bin, you're always going to make sure that you want to bury the food under the bedding. So I'm going to pull back my dry paper or my wet paper till they get to the center of the pile. I'm going to add my food to the middle, and then I'm going to put the paper back. And if I need to add some more dry paper on top, I could do that. The worms, they're kind of optimal temperature between 59 and 77 degrees. So please take that into consideration when you decide where to site your worm bin. I have mine in the backyard. It's under an awning. It's fully deep in the shade, and it's doing relatively well. Mine's just here by the front door. I usually don't have any problems with it. So make sure that you don't exceed those temperatures at least. They can handle things a little bit cooler. So if you are keeping it outside, it's always important to try to incorporate a little bit more bedding for them to kind of help insulate them. Because chances are, if it's cold, they're all going to be in the middle, all huddled together for warmth. If it's too hot, they're going to be spread out throughout the bin. And sometimes if I know there's a heat wave coming and it's going to be hot, sometimes I'll just take the lid off my worm bin. I might spritz the dry paper with some water and then put the lid back on. I want to try to keep the temperature a little bit cooler for them to make it a lot easier for them. All right. I talked about this briefly. What goes in and what stays out. A lot of the same things. And then a couple shots of my worm bin. You could start to expect to see worm castings or the finished product, worm poop, in about 3 to 4 months, and you can start harvesting it from that. Again, it's just similar to basic compost. How do I know it's ready? Because it's completely unrecognizable. Now, the finished product in the worm bin, the worm castings, are a lot different than the finished product in a basic composting system. I'm going to treat my worm castings more like a fertilizer than I am a soil amendment. It's going to be a lot higher nitrogen. Compost in general is pretty even keel as far as its nutrition is concerned, but worm castings are definitely nitrogen dominant. So I will use those sparingly. Usually I dilute them to the color of weak tea. If I'm incorporating them with anything with soil, I'm not going to use any more than 20% castings because they can be very potent. And if you do overuse them, they could technically kill your plants. And we're definitely trying to avoid that. But when used well, it really shows a lot of results. So I use worm castings for all my plants, whether they be fruit trees or annual edibles or house plants. They do a really great job with house plants, just as long as the plants that you're using them on are mostly just leaves and stems. Once the plant starts to flower or fruit, you definitely want to pull back and not use the worm castings because, again, it's all about nitrogen, which really supports the kind of the frame or the skeleton of the plant, the trunk, the leaves, the branches, the stems, all that stuff. And you really want to focus on the fruiting, which is dominated by phosphorus for the most part. But worm castings are great. I also use them to start seeds. If I'm transplanting plants and putting them outside for the first time, I will go ahead and water them in with the worm casting, especially things like peppers and tomatoes. I want to encourage that upward growth before they flower. So I'll take my flowers off my pepper and tomato plants until the plant gets to the size that I like, and then I'll allow for it to flower. In the meantime, it'll have the advent of getting a couple of doses of worm castings in order to encourage it to grow and make that skeleton, make that frame a little bit bigger so it can support more tomatoes and support more peppers. Again, everything else that stays out of your basic bin applies for what stays out of your worm bin, definitely. I also don't let people know, don't try to incorporate any kind of yard waste or anything into your worm bin as well, for a couple of reasons, especially if it's something like fresh leaves. In the bin, if there's too much nitrogen that's incorporated, it might actually start to get hot, and that would be problematic for your worms. So just stick to food scraps. And the nice thing about it is if you have a significant amount of yard waste and you have a lot of food scraps, that's two systems right there. So I say go for it. Of course, I'm going to say that, of course. I talked about the use. Dilute the color wheat tea. I have a picture of that coming up. So again, I want to talk about how to harvest it. For me, most of the time, me harvesting my worm castings from my worm bin is basically going in, pulling back the bedding, taking a handful, picking out the compost critters, picking out eggshells, or picking out any bedding, taking that handful, putting in a bucket, diluting it, see if it's good in color. If it's too much, I'll divide it into other buckets, and then I just use that to water. I do recommend to everybody that you harvest your entire bin at least once or twice a year, like empty out the bin, separate the compost critters from your castings, and start all over again and rebuild that pile with the wet paper, the food, and the worms and critters. I usually just kind of reserve a little bit of a leftover of my bin to kind of inoculate my new bin. So always leave that a little bit extra. And then when I finished harvesting all my castings, I generally put them in a large plastic bucket. I have one that has kind of like a hinged loose lid. I will use that. It's still going to keep the castings moist and viable. The top might get a little bit dry, but if I close the bin altogether, they're going to get moldy and get very wet. If I have no lid at all, they're going to completely dry out. And then take into consideration that your finished castings are not going to be compost critter free, because eggs pass along through that unbeknownst to you. So I don't mind that. I will just separate them out when the time comes for me to use it and put them back into the worm bin. But in the meantime, they're still kind of working the castings, and they're still kind of keeping them fresh just by their presence. So I like that as well. So there's the migration method. So again, if you have a fancy bin that has trays on it with those slotted bottoms, by the time you're ready to harvest, all that cardboard will be gone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take another one of the trays and I'm going to set it up. No cardboard on the bottom this time. Wet paper, food, no worms, because again, I want them to migrate. And I'm sorry, really quickly, I've stopped feeding them for about 2 weeks. So if you're doing the migration method, stop feeding your worms for 2 weeks. By the time you're all set to harvest with them, they're going to be nice and hungry. So again, wet paper, food, wet paper, dry paper. And then I'm going to take the new working tray with all the bedding and food on it, and I'm going to place it on top of my existing working tray where all my worms are, and making sure that the bottom of the top tray and the top of the bottom tray meet, so the worms and critters can do. And so what's going to happen is they're going to migrate from the bottom to the top where the food is, and then leaving the bottom portion virtually worm free. And again, there's always going to be some sort of stragglers. In a home bin, you have the option of doing the migration method. Instead of it going vertically, it's going to go horizontally. The situation is still the same. I'm still going to not feed them for 2 weeks, and then take any of the food out of the bin. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move all my castings all to one side of the bin, and I'm going to have a nice little empty spot on the side. and then that wet paper, food, wet paper, dry paper. And now the worms are going to travel from where there's no food, they're going to migrate horizontally to where there is food. Sometimes it takes about a week for that to happen, which is fine because you're not really, it's very low stakes and low work on your behalf. So you can always go back and check. And again, there's always going to be stragglers. There's the colander method. Again, that's similar to the method I use of just grabbing a handful. But in this case, I can grab a much larger handful. I'm going to get a colander that I am not going to use for anything for this purpose. Just go to the dollar store and grab one. And then I'm going to take the contents and throw that in the colander, put the colander over a bucket, and then I'm going to take the hose and I'm gonna filter the castings through the colander and then return any leftover food or bedding or any compost critters back into my worm bin, and then making sure I dilute that to the color of weak tea for sure. And then the last version is the pile method. So on a sunny or very bright day, I'm going to take a tarp or a piece of cardboard and I'm going to dump the entire contents of my, I think I have it. Oh no, I don't. Bummer. The entire contents of my worm bin on top of it. And then I'm going to create piles. Now worms, they don't like light. They like to run away from the light. So as I'm building these piles, I'm going to be able to scrape the finished castings off the piles until I see worms or compost critters. And then they're going to try to run. I'm going to move from pile to pile until eventually I have a pile of castings. And then I have a pile of all my compost critters. And then I'm going to reserve a little bit of that, that bin, the old bin, and then inoculate my new bin with that. And again, started off with the paper, the food, all my worms and compost critters, wet paper, and then dry paper on top, and start from that beginning. All right. One of the biggest issues generally for worm bins is red mites. I know that was one of the questions that they had. In this instance, it's a little bit more problematic in a worm bin than it definitely would be in a basic bin, because the worms don't have the capacity to flee in a worm bin, but they do in a basic bin. So the nice thing about it is, again, unless you want to be a total mite expert, I just say just get rid of them. So usually what I do is I take a couple pieces of bread, I put them in the bin, and it's going to attract the bread's going to attract the mites, and the mites are going to climb on that. And then I'm going to take the bread out, and then I'm going to go put that bread in the green bin. And then if the population is still not to my liking, I will continue to do that until the population goes down. You can see them on the sides. Sometimes they're just hanging out on the lid. So I might just take the lid outside and just rinse it off with a hose and just give it a little bit of a good cleaning and then return it. But red mites are usually the biggest issue, the biggest possible issue in a worm bin, because if they're predatory, they might attack your worms and try to outcompete them. Oh, here we go. There's the pile method. Works really well. And then diluted worm castings. Yours may look a little bit different. It might look like coffee with a little bit too much milk in it, but I always want to try it to be not too dark. You always want it to be kind of light, just so you don't end up using too much of it for sure. All right. Before I move on to hugelkultur, I just want to make sure we have any of these questions. Dried onion skins in a worm bin, sure, because there's not much aromatics to that. I don't see why that wouldn't be a problem. If used in excess, can the casting cause damage even if you leave it on top soil? The castings themselves, you always want to try to, another reason why I like to just dilute them is because you have to either really mix them in really, really well. But if you just put them on the top, what happens is sometimes they will have a tendency to get dried out, and a dried out casting becomes completely hydrophobic. So it won't even absorb any water. It won't even, you can't even spray it in order to get it to break up. So usually, and if you do use it in excess, your plants will let you know, because most likely they'll maybe turn a little bit too yellow. Or they might have speedy growth, but then that might just be it. So the castings really can't cause damage to the plants in excess, but the castings themselves will most likely degrade. So again, if you're going to be using them in soil, no more than 20%. You can put it around, but always try to incorporate them, if only with your hands, into the soil. So at least they can stay moist in the soil, and that way they don't become all dried out and hydrophobic. Oh, in a worm bin? That'd be interesting. I would have to source that out just because I don't have a bin. And also too, when it comes to buying a bin, which lends myself to this question, kind of, is the idea that you want the bin to be dark. They're worms, they're used to the dark. A clear or an opaque bin is going to force all your worms in the center of the pile, and that's where the food will have to be there entirely the entire time. So make sure it's dark, dark black or gray, nothing that light's going to penetrate through. So yeah, Rubbermaid bins are great. Just again, no more than a foot, and keep it shallow. Also too, you don't want it to be too big, especially if you're going to be moving it around, because there comes a point in time when you only have a little bit of castings, and then you have a lot of castings, and then your bin gets relatively heavy. So always make sure that, the smaller the bin, the less you're going to have to kind of lift it. What did I have in the house? Oh, that's my bin. Hold on. Or I just grab it. Oh. Here we go. This is my worm bin. Again, I drilled some holes along the top, along the sides here, just with the drill for air. And then, doesn't smell or anything. And this is what it kind of looks like on the inside. Again, that dry paper on the top. And I'm going to move everything to the side. You probably can't really see it in with the camera. But yeah, this is my bin. This is my travel bin. I use this to go to workshops because it's a lot smaller than the system I have in the backyard.
We
You
also
are welcome.
Oh, I'm sorry. We also had a question. Someone had raised their hand. Is it okay if I let them ask their question?
Oh yeah, totally. Of course.
Okay. And did she leave us now?
No, I think it's oh wait, there's a couple people. Is it Angel?
It was
I think
Shilpa, but
oh no, I see Shilpa, but I think Shilpa is still on mute. Still muted.
Shilpa, if you unmute yourself, we should be able to hear your question. Or maybe she lowered her hand. Okay, never mind.
Okay. All right. So hugel culture. I always like to incorporate it because it technically is like composting in place. So basically it's a no-till bed. So the idea it is you can make it to any size or height. If you're in a rental situation, you can put it on top of the ground. It requires a little bit more extra work on your behalf in order to do that. But traditionally, a hugel is I will dig a trench, 2 feet deep. I'm going to take the soil and I'm going to set that aside. And then in that empty cavity, I'm going to fill that bad boy up with a lot of organic material. I'm going to put logs in there. I'm going to put horse manure. I'm going to put food scraps. I'm going to put branches. There's different types of woods that you can and cannot use. And I will be, I told Victoria that I'm going to be sending out a PDF of this PowerPoint presentation, as well as some handouts about the stuff that I talked about today, so you can follow up. So different types of wood, and then I'm going to wet it and fill it up. And then I'm going to take the soil, that 2 feet of soil that I took out, and then I'm going to top it. And basically I've created a raised bed. So basically I'm composting all this material into place. There's going to be heat generated. So there's a way of kind of extending the season for that. The only issue I have with the hugel is as your wood fiber underneath starts to break down, it requires nitrogen in order to help facilitate that. So it starts to take nitrogen out of the soil and any kind of plants that you might have. So hugels I always feel like are a great thing to kind of set up in the fall when there's a lot of tree trimming, when there's a lot of organic material like leaves and all kinds of stuff that you can kind of gather. And then again, as everything starts to settle and break down, the hugel itself is going to start to settle and the soil will start to settle. So do it like late fall, I mean early fall, and then wait and then plant in the spring. And then if I were to plant in the spring, I might start with something neutral like potatoes, or I might do legumes in order to incorporate that nitrogen and make sure that nitrogen, it's called nitrogen drag when it pulls nitrogen out of the soil. That's always just my biggest concern. Other than that, I think hugels are amazing. So you're really dealing with a lot of raised bed width based on just full of all kinds of organic material that your plant will be able to take advantage of. All right. So I always want to talk about compost critters just because they do work really, really hard for us. Our number one and number two, of course, there's fungi. They're the primary decomposition. They break down decaying material. If you ever find there's like this kind of cobwebby looking stuff, sometimes you see it under mulch, sometimes you see it in your compost pile. It is actinomycetes. It's a half breed, part bacteria, part fungus. That's what gives your compost that sweet kind of earthy smell. That's what the smell that you're definitely looking for. When your bin is too moist or too many greens in it, you may see soldier fly larvae on that. They are champs at breaking down material. If you don't believe me, then just go onto YouTube and put soldier fly larvae eats fish, and then just watch that video because they just really take it to town. A lot of composters are using soldier fly larvae specifically as their kind of first line of defense, especially to break down huge quantities of things like green material, a lot of manures, and usually a lot of farmers, they'll have a glut of certain things. All that stuff needs to be broken down relatively quickly. And soldier fly larvae do well. So you'll see sometimes the live larvae, or sometimes you'll see whatever's left, and then just a little fly leaves, and that fly is not problematic at all. Worms, definitely going to want to see those. They're definitely going to come for the free food. They have this mucus on the outside of their body that as they pass through the soil, it forces the soil to kind of grip together and create aggregates. You want your soil to be kind of chunky. And then again, the worms are there to eat, and then they enrich your compost with their castings and work very, very hard to eat that food as well. Sow bugs, isopods, roly-polies, pill bugs, whatever you would like to call them. Again, these are our first line folks. These are the ones that break down the lignin, break down the cellulose, break down all the high fiber material, shred it, and then make it accessible for things like bacteria and fungus to come and to eat it, and break it down so the worms can actually eat it, because worms don't have teeth. Oh, there we go. Sweet. Oh, right on 5 minutes. Nice. All right. Let's see what other questions we have for everybody. Yeah. Google means tell it. Yep, for sure. Yeah. Yes, you can build it straight on top of your front lawn. So instead of digging the trench, you'll have to kind of go out and get soil in order to kind of top it. And then and then some people like to make like a frame. I actually built a hugel pile in an old crate that I got last year. I wasn't sure what was in it, but I decided I was going to plant native plants in it. So over the course of several weeks, several months, actually, I continually started to fill that. And then I had to purchase soil. So you could do it in a container. There's a lot of little systems that I've seen that are metal that create a frame. But if you want to just kind of make your own hugel, you can get logs or branches, make a frame of the size that you want, and then just fill it. I say no more than 2 or 3 feet tall as you build it, maybe 4 feet as you tall, because it will eventually shrink as everything starts to break down. And then just making sure that you have room and enough to kind of put that soil on top as well. So yeah, Maybe not for this summer, but maybe for next summer for sure. Oh, pincher bugs. Pincher bugs, they will try to show up. They might try to do battle. They're not very good. If you're trying to get rid of them, if their populations are too much, the really easy way is a just a rolled up newspaper with like a tie, tie it or tape it or something. You might throw it on top of the pile or throw it in your garden if you've got pincher bugs there. They're going to crawl in there in the middle of the night. And then in the morning, you're just going to take a bucket of water and you're going to unroll that newspaper and they're all going to fall down into the bucket and drown. So, but again, if you're out there, working your compost pile, I don't see any pincher bugs in my worm bin, but I've seen them in my basic bin for sure. All right, great. Was that the only questions?
It seems like it. The hand has gone down and has not popped back up. So I think
Okay.
the questions have been addressed.
Well, right on. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity. Thanks to Bosca and thanks to the City of Santa Clara for having me. I appreciate this and always a great opportunity to teach everybody. If you have any questions, you can find me. That's my email. You can also find me on social media where you can find out where I'm teaching either via Zoom or in person. So please definitely check it out. If you do have any questions for composting, please feel free to reach out as well. My goal is to see everyone be successful. So please do that. And again, I will definitely be following up with handouts. So please be on the lookout for those as well. Thank you for Victoria for making that possible too.
And thank you so much. It's been a wonderful class. I took tons of notes.
Oh, great. Great, great, great.
So,
Yeah, you got that chicken manure.
absolutely. I'm going to put it to good work.
You definitely should. You definitely should.
Well, thank you so much for a great class, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.